In the fading light of a dying empire, the marble columns of Rome still gleamed under the Mediterranean sun, but something ancient and inevitable stirred beneath the surface. Citizens hurried through the forum, their sandals slapping against worn stone, voices echoing with the familiar rhythm of commerce and gossip. Senators debated in grand halls lined with statues of forgotten victories, while legions patrolled distant frontiers that grew harder to hold with each passing season. This was the world of the late Western Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries, a civilization that had conquered continents, built aqueducts that carried water for miles, and woven law and culture into the fabric of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Yet beneath the grandeur lay fractures no one dared name aloud. The empire that once seemed eternal now balanced on the edge of oblivion, its old systems, centralized authority, economic vitality, military supremacy, straining against forces they could no longer contain. The collapse did not arrive with thunderous fanfare. It crept forward like twilight, silent and patient, waiting for the moment when the weight of centuries would finally prove too heavy to bear. For generations, daily life in Roman cities had followed a comforting cadence. Farmers in the Italian countryside tended olive groves and wheat fields under the watchful gaze of villa owners, their harvests feeding bustling markets in Ravenna and Milan. In the streets of Rome itself, bakers fired ovens at dawn, filling the air with the scent of fresh bread, while merchants haggled over spices from the east, and slaves carried loads through crowded alleys. Children played amid the ruins of older temples, and families gathered for evening meals under oil lamps, reciting tales of emperors past. The imperial bureaucracy, vast and intricate, collected taxes, maintained roads, and dispensed justice according to codes refined over hundreds of years. People rose with the sun and retired with the stars, trusting that the Pax Romana, though faded, still offered protection from the chaos beyond the borders. This rhythm felt unbreakable, a testament to human ingenuity and endurance. Yet even in these ordinary moments, subtle shifts whispered of deeper troubles. Inflation gnawed at savings, coinage debased with cheaper metals, and the once reliable grain shipments from Africa grew erratic. Most dismissed these as temporary inconveniences, the cost of maintaining greatness. No one understood what was coming next. Early warning signs appeared like faint cracks in a grand mosaic, invisible to those too close to see the full pattern. Barbarian tribes along the Rhine and Danube grew bolder, their raids no longer mere border skirmishes, but probing attacks against weakened garrisons. Emperors rotated through the throne with alarming frequency, each promising restoration, while the treasury emptied, and the army relied increasingly on foreign mercenaries whose loyalty proved fickle. Corruption spread through provincial administrations, where governors enriched themselves at the expense of public works. Climate fluctuations and soil exhaustion reduced agricultural yields, while plague outbreaks thinned populations and disrupted trade networks that had sustained the empire for centuries. Intellectuals and administrators noted these issues in letters and reports, yet reforms remained piecemeal, hampered by political infighting and the sheer inertia of a system built for expansion rather than contraction. The empire's old mechanisms, reliance on slave labor, heavy taxation to fund endless military campaigns, and a rigid social hierarchy, began to falter under new pressures. Still, the illusion of permanence held. Citizens repaired aqueducts and celebrated festivals, believing the gods or fortune would favor Rome once more. By the time the signs became clear to a few perceptive minds, the momentum toward rupture had already gathered force. As the 5th century deepened, rising tension gripped the provinces like an invisible hand tightening around the throat of the state. Visigoths, pushed by the Huns sweeping from the Eurasian steppes, crossed into Roman territory seeking refuge and land, only to clash with imperial forces in a cycle of uneasy treaties and broken promises. Economic instability accelerated. Hyperinflation made everyday transactions chaotic, while large landowners withdrew into self-sufficient estates, weakening the central authority that once coordinated the empire. Military recruitment suffered as free citizens avoided service, leaving legions dependent on unreliable allies. In the imperial courts, rival factions schemed for power, assassinations became commonplace, and decisions made in distant palaces often ignored the realities faced by frontier commanders. The old systems of patronage and loyalty, which had bound the empire together, now fragmented along ethnic and regional lines. Fear spread through whispered conversations in marketplaces and behind closed villa doors. Travelers reported ghost towns where thriving communities once stood, abandoned due to raids or famine. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with anticipation. Leaders issued edicts promising renewal, yet each proclamation rang hollow against the gathering storm. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, in the slow erosion of trust, resources, and cohesion that no decree could reverse. Key decisions and mounting pressures sealed the fate of the Western Empire with tragic inevitability. Emperor Valens, desperate for manpower, permitted large groups of Goths to settle inside Roman borders in 376 AD. A pragmatic move that soon backfired amid mistreatment and revolt. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD shattered Roman military prestige when Gothic forces annihilated a field army and killed the emperor himself. Successive rulers like Honorius and his generals navigated alliances with one barbarian group against another, granting lands and titles in exchange for nominal loyalty. Heavy taxation to sustain these arrangements crushed small farmers, driving them into debt or banditry. The sack of Rome by Alaric's Visigoths in 410 AD, though not the total destruction later imagined, sent psychological shockwaves across the Mediterranean. For the first time in 800 years, the Eternal City fell to invaders. Yet even then, many clung to hope, viewing it as a temporary humiliation rather than a death knell. Internal divisions between pagans and Christians, eastern and western halves of the empire, further paralyzed effective response. The old imperial system, designed for conquest and administration of vast territories, could no longer adapt to a world of decentralized power and relentless external migration. The stakes compounded: over-reliance on foederati troops, failure to address economic roots of discontent, and the inability to forge a unified identity beyond the fading glory of Rome itself. The moment the system began to fail arrived not in a single cataclysm, but through cascading breakdowns that accelerated in the 450s and 460s. Hunnic invasions under Attila ravaged the Balkans and Gaul, forcing desperate coalitions that drained remaining resources. Provincial governors increasingly acted independently, minting local coinage and raising private armies as central directives lost meaning. Supply lines collapsed. Rome's dependence on North African grain became a fatal vulnerability when Vandal fleets seized Carthage in 439 AD and later sacked the city again. Infrastructure crumbled, roads fell into disrepair, aqueducts leaked, and forums emptied as populations declined or fled to safer rural strongholds. In the silence of abandoned villas, dust settled on mosaics depicting triumphant legions, while wolves prowled overgrown fields. The imperial court, relocated to Ravenna's marshes for defense, issued orders that frontier commanders ignored. The old mechanisms of taxation, justice, and defense simply stopped functioning in large swaths of territory. By 476 AD, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, few Romans even noticed the symbolic end. The collapse unfolded as a process of disintegration, where the state's monopoly on violence, money, and legitimacy evaporated, leaving a vacuum that new powers would slowly fill. Human consequences of this rupture reshaped lives across the former empire with profound cruelty and resilience. Entire communities vanished or transformed. Cities that once housed tens of thousands shrank to villages huddled within ruined walls. Trade networks fractured, plunging regions into localized barter economies, where luxury goods from distant lands became relics of a lost age. Famine and disease claimed countless lives, while banditry and local warlords preyed on travelers and farmers alike. Families separated by migration or enslavement mourned in silence, their routines shattered by the constant threat of violence. Yet, amid the breakdown, new social forms emerged. Germanic kingdoms blending Roman law with tribal customs, Christian monasteries preserving literacy and classical knowledge in isolated enclaves. Survivors adapted with grim determination, fortifying hilltop settlements and forging alliances based on personal loyalty rather than distant imperial edicts. The fear that once lingered unspoken now defined daily existence. The creak of unfamiliar horses at dusk, the absence of tax collectors replaced by tribute demands from new masters. Children grew up knowing only fragmented memories of Roman order, their world smaller, harsher, yet alive with possibility. The social fabric tore, but threads of continuity, language, faith, agricultural knowledge persisted through the chaos. In the long term, the fall of the Western Roman Empire marked one of history's great pivots, ushering in the medieval world while leaving an indelible legacy. The vacuum enabled the rise of successor states, Ostrogoths in Italy, Visigoths in Spain, Franks in Gaul, whose blended cultures laid foundations for modern Europe. Latin evolved into Romance languages, Roman law influenced emerging legal systems, and Christianity spread as a unifying force across fractured lands. Infrastructure built by Roman engineers endured in fragments, guiding future roads and cities. Yet the loss was immense. Centralized administration gave way to feudal fragmentation, urban life declined for centuries, and technological and economic regression characterized the early Middle Ages. Historians centuries later would debate whether this constituted true collapse or transformation, but for those who lived through it, the rupture felt absolute. The old systems, once symbols of human achievement, could no longer survive the pressures of migration, economic strain, environmental challenges, and internal decay. Their failure created space for reinvention, proving that even the mightiest empires are mortal, bound by the same limits that govern all human endeavors. The echoes of Rome's fall resonate through time as a haunting reminder of fragility. Ruins stand silent across Europe and North Africa, columns toppled by earthquakes or quarried for new buildings, their stones whispering of ambitions that outstripped endurance. What remains is not just debris but a cautionary pattern. Civilizations rise through innovation and unity, only to strain under their own complexity when adaptation falters. In the quiet hours before dawn, one can almost hear the distant sounds of marching legions, fading into memory, replaced by the wind through empty forums. The collapse did not erase humanity's drive to build and govern, it redefined it, forcing new forms from the wreckage. As we examine our own era of interconnected systems, technological dependencies, and global pressures, Rome's story lingers like a shadow, proof that no order is permanent, and that when old systems can no longer survive, the world does not end, but transforms in ways both devastating and unforeseen. The ruins teach patience, humility, and the recognition that history unfolds not in triumphs alone, but in the quiet moments when the familiar order begins to slip away forever.